is EWA Radio, the podcast of the Education Writers Association. I'm public editor and your host, Kavitha Cardoza. I'm delighted to chat with Brian Rosenthal, an investigative reporter for the New York Times, who was co-author of a fantastic piece in Hasidic Enclaves, Failing Private Schools Flush with Public Money, on how students in some Hasidic schools are being denied a basic education in reading, math, and social studies. You should read it. EWA members may also remember Brian as the recipient of the Hechinger Grand Prize for Distinguished Education Reporting in 2017 for his piece Denied: How Texas Keeps Tens of Thousands of Children Out of Special Education when he was at the Houston Chronicle. Brian, we're sorry your colleague Eliza Shapiro couldn't be here, but we're delighted you could make the time.
Thanks for having me.
How often do you look into education issues, and what interests you about it?
Quite a bit, it turns out. I'm an investigative reporter on the Metro desk, and so I do investigative stories about New York City and New York State. But I find myself looking at education quite a bit. It was my first job as a journalist. I was an education beat reporter. But I think more importantly, it's just a tremendously important beat, and it's a great source of investigations because kids' lives are at stake. And what happens in schools has a huge impact on our communities, our families, and kind of everything that we hold dear. And so I really love reporting about education.
Brian, let me ask you about your piece. So can you explain where Hasidic yeshivas fit into the education landscape?
Sure. So just to kind of paint the picture, there are about 7,000 schools in K-12 schools in New York State. About 5,000 of those are public schools. Then 2,000 of them are private schools. Of the private schools, most of those are religious schools of some sort. And you can filter down to just the Jewish schools, which is about 500. These are Jewish schools, also called yeshivas. And that is 500 Jewish schools of all types, from the most conservative to the most liberal. If you zoom in just on Hasidic schools, you're talking about approximately 275 Hasidic schools statewide, and they serve about 100,000 kids. And if you zoom in even more than that on the boys' schools, which is what we did, just looking at the all-boys schools, it's a little less than 150 schools and serving a little more than 50,000 boys.
Okay. And how did you come upon this topic?
It started for us in 2019 when the New York City Department of Education made an announcement. They said that they had done review of 28 Hasidic schools in New York City and found that only 2 of them were providing an adequate education. And then that's basically all they said. The city did not say the names of the schools. They didn't say where the schools were or why they weren't complying with the law or what the impact of that was on the kids. And they didn't say what they were going to do about it. And in fact, they didn't end up doing anything about it. And so I saw that and was really surprised. And I happened to sit next to Eliza Shapiro in the New York Times newsroom. And Eliza is our Metro desk education reporter. And so we sit next to each other. We're always talking about the news. And so we just started talking about this and figured that if the city wasn't going to look into this, then somebody should, and it might as well be us.
Your investigation went so much deeper than just the academics, though. It took more than a year, and both of you read thousands of documents. Many were translated from Yiddish. You interviewed more than 275 people and analyzed millions of rows of data on these failing public schools. The results are almost unbelievable. I mean, I could not believe, Brian, that this was happening in New York. Can you share some of your top-line findings?
Yeah, sure. And I think if Eliza were here, she would tell you that she reports on quote unquote failing schools all the time. And I think you're used to hearing about some schools facing a lot of challenges with poverty or homelessness that see something like 10% of their students pass, or maybe 15% of their students pass. And what we found in these schools is that less than 1% of students can pass the standardized tests. Most of the Hasidic schools don't actually take the tests because they're not required to, but the ones that do, most of the schools that take the test don't have a single student at their school who can pass the test. So yeah, test score is very low. We also talked to more than 3 dozen teachers and reviewed a lot of student work and found that that kind of matched up, that students were leaving these schools unable to read and write in English fluently, in some cases even speak English fluently, and do anything more than basic, addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. And so, yeah, it was very, very stunningly poor performance.
And then you're also uncovered a lot of corporal punishment, physical punishment.
Yeah, this was something that we were not planning to report about when we started on the project. We were focused on the quality of the education. But as we started to interview people, and as you said, we interviewed 275 people. Of all the students and teachers and parents who we talked about, basically every single one said that corporal punishment is very common in these schools. And we heard story after story after story of teachers punishing students for minor misbehavior. And so we felt we had to include that as well. And so we did. We shared some of those stories as part of the article.
One of the most stunning things to me were some kind of images that you shared, which are up on the website, of women blacked out of textbooks. Like when there's a picture of a woman, it's censored.
Yeah. A lot of the textbooks, definitely any women or girls in the boys' schools are censored. And the amount of censorship was actually surprising to us because it went pretty far. I mean, any secular holidays were censored in some of these books. Something like Halloween would be censored. Words like library were censored because these students are not allowed to go to the library. College was censored because in many cases these students are discouraged from going to college. And so, yeah, I mean, there was significant censorship in a lot of the textbooks that we reviewed.
And apart from the injustice of children growing up without like a basic education, this is a like much larger interest because of the money involved and some of the societal impacts, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Our reporting found that there is a large amount of taxpayer money that is going to these schools. And so some people might look at these schools and say, well, it's, they're a religious community. They have a right to do whatever they want. Well, in reality, it's our money that is funding these schools. That's what our reporting found. We identified in the 1 year that we focused on $375 million in taxpayer money.
Wow.
I mean, just to be clear, public schools do get more public money than these schools do. But these schools get more private money than any other type of private school in New York State. And so that was a real surprising finding to us. It funds a majority of their budgets in many cases. Taxpayer money is not supposed to fund religious education, but we found in the budgets that we looked at that the majority of the budget was being funded by taxpayer money in one way or another.
And then, of course, you had interviewed some of the former students who said they graduated and they couldn't read or write. They didn't have a bank account. Like they couldn't, it stopped them from living, in some cases, full lives.
Yeah, I think the lack of education impacts different people in different ways. There are certainly some people who leave those schools and they are able to have success in the community with certain advantages that they have. But the vast majority of people are not able to make a decent living. And some of them stay in the community and they face poverty there. We found that these Hasidic neighborhoods have the highest rates of poverty of anywhere in New York State. In some cases, we're talking about 70% of people living in poverty. And then, yeah, the other people who leave the community who want to live in the secular world, they really don't have the skills to get a job or make a decent living either. And we talked to many of those people who told us about their struggles as well.
Mm-hmm. One paragraph that stuck with me from your writing is, the students in the boys' schools are not simply falling behind. They are suffering from levels of educational deprivation not seen anywhere else in New York. Was there a story that stuck with you?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the stories that we heard stuck with us and will stick with us for a long time. One that comes to my mind now is a man named Mendy Pape. He graduated from or attended a yeshiva, Hasidic yeshiva in Crown Heights in Brooklyn, and he ended up leaving the community and facing an incredible amount of struggle to make a living. He ended up moving to Montreal, and he was homeless for quite a while. He couldn't find a job. He finally found a job at a bagel factory and was working as much as he could, but he still couldn't afford an apartment. So he slept on park benches and he napped at McDonald's. And he told us that this had a really significant impact on his mental health. And at some point, he ended up depressed and feeling suicidal and attempted to take his own life. And he spent time in a psychiatric hospital. He told us then about how he was able to scrape together enough money to get an apartment, and he met a neighbor of his who took it upon herself to teach him English in her spare time. And this neighbor also, he said, gave him the first English book that he's ever had, Green Eggs and Ham. He was 28 years old.
Wow.
So he was able to start to get more of an education, and he eventually went to nursing school, and he just graduated, and so he has a nursing degree, and so he's finding some stability now at age 33. But it really took quite a journey for him to get there.
Mm-hmm. How did you find people?
Yeah, I mean, it was a mix. I mean, we wanted to talk to as many people as possible. And so, there are organizations that work with people leaving the Hasidic community and help them. And they were able to connect us with some people in that situation. We then asked the Hasidic people that they connected us to we asked them to connect us to other people, to family members or to friends, including people who are still in the Hasidic community. We made a real big point to talk to people who were in the Hasidic community currently. And so we also then pursued other ways of finding people. We looked on social media. We looked on message boards. We actually just went outside of schools and talked to people. And we also were trying to find people through, I would say, more conventional reporting tactics. Like one of the things I always do is use LinkedIn to find former employees. And that is something I did for this story, trying to find former employees of schools and of these Hasidic schools, and having them then connect us to their former colleagues or former students or anybody that they could connect us with. So we kind of pieced it together from one person to another, but it was just so important for us to talk to as many people as possible.
You also reached out to leaders of the largest Hasidic boys' schools for a response on dozens of occasions by telephone, email, in person, and they declined. How did you get around kind of not having the other side, so to speak?
We worked really hard to get the perspective of Hasidic leaders. I can tell you that we did have some conversations with them throughout the process that they asked to be off the record. And so I can't talk about them, or I can't, we couldn't put them into the story, but we were having those conversations along the way. And we also, again, made it a point to have people we were talking to who were currently in the community who had nuanced views about some of these complicated issues. And so we really engaged in those conversations fully. We also looked up the statements of the Hasidic leaders over the years, both statements they made to their community, which we use translators sometimes to translate the statements they made in speeches to the community and things of that nature. And also, statements that they had made to the public previously. And in the end, after this long reporting process in which we tried every step of the way to get more on the record conversations, in the end, we were able to connect with many of the Hasidic leaders right before the story published. They finally came to the table and they shared their perspective, and we happily included it in the story as well.
I want to come back to that in just a minute, but when we're talking about building trust, I assume, Brian, that you're Jewish from your last name. Is that accurate?
That's accurate, and Eliza is as well.
Okay, so I mean, obviously, it's a very diverse community. But did that fact make a difference at all when you were doing interviews?
I don't know. It may have, but I mean, I think in an insular community like that, you're either part of the community or you're not. And even if you are Jewish, if you're not part of the community, it might not be as much of a help as you think it is.
Mm-hmm. I find sometimes, like when I have done stories on the Indian community, I feel like oftentimes there's an assumption that the story will be very positive because there's some kind of shared background. But I understand what you're saying. On the flip side, many education journalists report on communities other than their own, and sometimes those stories don't show the community in a very positive light, like the one you all did. Did you all have conversations about that?
Yeah, absolutely. It was very important to us to make sure we were being fair. We did, without getting into too much detail, because I can't, but we did consult with some people in the Hasidic community and experts on the Hasidic community about how we were framing things and if we were being fair, and that was really important to us. And again, those conversations with community members were a real opportunity to stress test different things we were saying. And then, I mean, the other thing is, one of the things that's nice about being at the New York Times is we have some of the most talented journalists in the world, including some of the most talented editors. And we had really robust conversations with our editors about these issues, thinking through if we were being as fair and as open and even-handed as we could be. And so we really worked to have those hard conversations and make sure it was reflected in the story.
I want to go back to the thousands of documents. How did you keep track of everything? What kind of software did you use, or what was your process?
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of obsessed with organization, I have to admit, and it wasn't particularly complicated. We use Google. We used a Google Drive, which Eliza and I both had access to, along with our editor. I mean, my strategy for organization involves a lot of folders and subfolders, and then subfolders of subfolders, and also many spreadsheets that kind of tell us where things are. And so we would have spreadsheets of, all of the sources that we talked to, spreadsheets, of course, of all the schools and all the funding that each of them got, but also spreadsheets of all of our documents, spreadsheets of all of our FOIL requests, just spreadsheets upon spreadsheets. When I talk about organization, I try to emphasize that I don't think there's one right method for organizing reporting. There's no one magic trick that you can use. But what's important is that you dedicate time to thinking about it and that you're very intentional about it. And so we would carve out time each day to make sure that everything was in its proper place. And if we got to a point where things were not in their proper place, we would make time for putting them in their proper place. And then we had a process at the end of going through everything in a real structured way to make sure we weren't missing anything.
In a big project, in any project really, I find myself waking up in the middle of the night wondering whether I've triple checked facts, and you go over interviews in your head. It's super stressful. So do you worry at all, or how do you deal with that? Or is your subfolders of subfolders of subfolders enough to kind of cushion you from that?
No, it's not enough to cushion. There's never any cushion. I think it helps when you've done the number of investigative projects that I've done at this point in my career. But yeah, I mean, I had those thoughts. I know Eliza had those thoughts. The good news is when you're on an investigative project, you have time to stress test things and to fine tune things. And we went through many drafts. The other thing that I really believe in is openness with sources. I believe very strongly in not surprising anybody. And that includes, for me, even though I'm not allowed to share a copy of the full story with sources before it comes out, I will call the sources before all my sources before it comes out, and I will tell them exactly how they will be quoted, how they will be named, and I'll go over all the facts with them. And I think that is only fair to them when they're sharing so much of themselves with us. And that makes me feel a lot better because I know that they understand what's coming and they agree, and we've had that conversation. And I also reach out to everybody who's not quoted in the story, and I mean, I can't talk on the phone with all 275 people, but I'll at least send an email, let them know the story is coming, let them know they're not going to be quoted, maybe give them a quick overview of what we found, because I think we owe that to them.
I saw a lot of pushback on social media about the story once it was published. What did some in the Hasidic community find unfair? And how did you respond? How do you think about criticism?
Yeah, so first I would say that the Hasidic leaders have not asked for any corrections. They've not really identified any factual errors that they believe that we made. There has been some people who've written on social media and elsewhere asking basically, why are you focused on us? Why don't you mind your own business? Don't
I saw a lot of that
on our community. I mean, my response to that is, I don't know if the Hasidic leaders read the New York Times every day, but, we write about a lot of parts of our community and parts of our world, and Hasidic leaders were asking us to write about public schools. Well, Eliza and I have written about public schools a lot, and about the failings of public schools. There were also people in the Hasidic community who felt that it was unfair of us to do a story just about the failings of the education system and not mention the good things about the Hasidic community. And first of all, I mean, we did put quite a bit about good things about the Hasidic community in the story, but I think the larger point is, why not have a separate stories about the positive things of the community if you're going to write a story about the negative parts of the community. And I understand that. I totally understand that, and I think that's something that we as journalists need to be careful about. I would say I think we have written stories about positive parts of the Hasidic community in the past, and this story was an important story that really needed to be told, that we felt that there was an obligation to the children who were affected by this to tell the story. And so I understand some of those concerns, and I still think that we did what we needed to do with the story.
Mm-hmm. What impact did your piece have, and are you continuing to report on this issue?
We are continuing to report on the issue. We saw just a couple of days after we published our story that the State Board of Education passed some new regulations for non-public schools in New York State. And those regulations had been in the works for years, actually. And so we're not, a response to our article, but we will be closely following how they're implemented. And, hopefully now that this reporting's out there and people have a better idea of the issues, they'll be able to implement those new regulations better. The other impact that we've seen is that the city, which I mentioned that 2019 report that kind of set us off on this story, the city announced after months of us asking questions, the city told us that they would be restarting that investigation and that they would finish the work that they started. And so we'll be watching that. And then finally, there's been a lot of conversation about corporal punishment in the days after the story ran. And I think that a lot of people were really struck by what our reporting found about corporal punishment. And they were also struck by the fact that in New York State, corporal punishment is not prohibited in private schools. And
I should just say here, because we know from research how damaging it can be.
Yeah. And in New York State, it's prohibited in public schools, but the law is basically silent about private schools. So several state lawmakers have said they want to address that, and they want to make sure that it is prohibited in private schools as well, and that the rules are clearer, and there's more detail about what schools can and cannot do. And so we'll be following that as well. It seems like that may be one of the things that gets picked up on as a result of the story.
Mm-hmm. That's just amazing. Brian, I want to leave you with the last thought. What have you learned from this investigation? And I don't mean like a data point. I mean kind of like a life lesson that you will carry with you.
Wow, that's such a good question. What I would say for me personally, as you mentioned earlier, I am Jewish, but I haven't had a whole lot of interaction with the Hasidic community in my life with that part of Judaism. And so, it was meaningful in some ways for me on that front. And the people who I have met are incredibly resilient. I mean, there were so many people who we interviewed who did not get any sort of an education and yet have managed to find success or have managed to find happiness, or are struggling but have an attitude of figuring out what they can do instead of focusing on what they can't do. So I think I will take with me some of that resilience that people in the community have, and what they were generous enough to share with us.
My guest is Brian Rosenthal, an investigative reporter with the New York Times. He, along with his colleague Eliza Shapiro, spent more than a year investigating Hasidic schools in New York. You can follow him on Twitter at Brian M. Rosenthal. Thank you so much, Brian, for making time to chat.
Thank you.
That wraps up this episode of EWA Radio. I'm Kavitha Cardoza. Do you have questions for Brian? Let's continue the conversation on Twitter at EdWriters. Special thanks to Angelina Liu and Kristan Obang from EWA, as well as Raul Garcia for production assistance. The mission of the Education Writers Association is to strengthen the community of education journalists and improve the quality of education coverage. For more than 75 years, EWA has helped reporters get the story right. Thanks for listening and lifting up education journalism.